Welcome to Uncommons. I'm Nate Erskine-Smith, and on this episode, I'm joined by two different guests. First, Columbia Law student Safia Southey. She's a dual citizen of Canada and the United States. She's Jewish, and she's an advocate for Palestinian human rights. She was also part of the Encampment at Columbia that has sparked so many protests and encampments across North American campuses. I came across an interview of hers and thought she was thoughtful and invited her on. Now, a lot of attention has been focused on campuses, and I don't want to lose sight of what the students are protesting. So our second guest is a thoracic surgeon here in Ontario, Amgad Elsherif, who has worked to deliver emergency healthcare services in Gaza amidst the overwhelming destruction. Before we get to the guests, there are two things that need to be said. First, there are hearings going on right now at the Justice Committee in Parliament to address anti-Semitism on campuses here in Canada. It should not need to be said, but anti-Semitism is despicable. No one should be hated for who they are, and the horrors of history and the Holocaust show us where that hate can lead. No one should be discriminated against for being Jewish, and no one, simply because they are Jewish, should be held accountable for the actions of Israel. That is anti-Semitism all the way down. What isn't anti-Semitism is criticism of the state of Israel and its policies. It's indiscriminate bombing and blocking of humanitarian aid. It's decades-long mistreatment of Palestinians. Its expansion of settlements. Its refusal to acknowledge the Palestinian right to self-determination. Second, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor has announced charges against Hamas leaders for war crimes and against Israeli leaders for different war crimes. Hamas and its terrorism must be held to account, no question. We've also said that Israel has the right to defend itself in keeping with humanitarian law, and when it fails to do so, it must be held to account as well. Canada helped to create the International Criminal Court. We benefit from and have long contributed to the creation of a rules-based international order. Now, just this morning, the International Court of Justice has issued a new decision in which it orders Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah and to ensure the unhindered provision at scale of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. As the ICJ puts it, the humanitarian situation is now to be characterized as disastrous. Well, we should respect and abide by the rules-based international order to the extent we can still say we have one. And of course, that includes the ICC and its processes, and of course, it includes the ICJ. No one should be above the law. Safia, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, you are dual citizen Canadian American. You are a Columbia Law student. You have been involved in the encampment at Columbia, which is going to be what we talk about, but it's really interesting because we've got encampments now at different universities across Canada. Some have been cracked down on, others have not been. Actually, the McGill encampment, there have been motions for an injunction, and the courts have pushed back on that a couple of different times. But the Columbia protest was covered by, run down the list: PBS, USA Today, CNN, CBC, Reuters, Rolling Stone, BBC, Washington Post, Time, and on and on and on and on. You are studying, and you're focused on your studies. And when the encampment first takes place mid-April, are you involved right away? At what point do you get involved in it?
Yeah, I wasn't involved right away. Actually, there was the Student Justice for Palestine group had started making encampments. I think they were there for about 30 hours. It was just a group of tents. I had a couple of friends who had slept there but weren't directly involved. And then I remember 30 hours in, the police came and everybody started swarming around with hundreds and thousands of students. And so it was only once those arrests started happening on the second day of the encampments being there and the students being hauled away with everybody kind of swarming the area that I feel like a lot of students got really impassioned about it or realized the horror of how our school was responding to it. So it was only then that I kind of got involved, which is while the arrests were happening on one lawn, there was a group of students who started jumping over to a second lawn, kind of in protest of everything that was happening. So I was one of those first few students who jumped over to the second lawn. We're like, if they're going to arrest them, they should arrest all of us. It was very dramatic. And then we just kind of stayed there for quite a long time. It was very exciting and definitely not pre-planned on my part.
Well, I was reading the Columbia Spectator's rundown and timeline, and one student had said effectively what you're saying now. More than 100 student groups were involved eventually, but it was really they arrested 100 people and 1,000 more sprang up in their place. So you were one of those 1,000 people, and then it kept growing, and it lasted quite a long time. I mean, obviously the police cracked down initially, as you say, within the first 30 hours, but it wasn't until the end of April then, so really 2 weeks or so of camping out there and eventually storming Hamilton Hall that really brought it all to a head at the end of April.
Yeah, I mean, our president, President Shafiq, I think it was a very poor move with the initial arrests because number one, it was very public. It was not done with the consent of, I think, the board of trustees. Nobody knew what was happening, and people were so shocked and outraged by like the immediate arrest of the students that I think that she was then scared to do it again. So she gave a lot of leeway, then kind of not necessarily leeway, but it was much harder for her to take immediate action after that first
Right.
wave of arrests because there was so much pushback. So then we just kind of stayed there for quite a while, tried to do negotiations. Obviously, it did not go too well. But there was a lot of time where you can just kind of build and build the movement, the lawn, and people are coming and going and coming. The encampments were coming out all over the country, all over the world, and they didn't really know what to do with us because they couldn't just simply arrest everybody all over again.
And who is us? So many different people have different motivations for being there. You're a law student at Columbia. Maybe speak to your background and your familial background, but what brought you to jump to that lawn?
Yeah. Firstly, there's just it was such a wide array of students. It was mostly undergraduate Columbia students, which was interesting. A lot of people who I think were um, very new to this idea of like activism. It's the cliche young idealistic undergrads who want to go and make a statement. From my personal experience, I come from a Jewish family on my mother's side. I grew up very interested in kind of Middle Eastern politics to the extent that I moved to Jordan after high school to actually go work with the UN Relief and Works Agency, working with Palestinian refugees. I did my entire undergraduate degree on Middle Eastern politics and governments, my thesis on UNRWA and Palestinian refugees. And now at law school, I am studying international human rights law to try to work on exactly these issues. And so I had really not been involved that much actually in the protesting of this past year. And it mostly because I felt that it was very futile in this space, that it was a lot of back and forth statements and everything. There was a time in October when there was buses going around at Columbia with people's faces on them saying like Columbia's biggest anti-Semites if you like signed on to
Oh,
papers.
wow.
Yeah, a lot of students were getting doxxed, like public information, still are. And so I kind of took a step back in a lot of those spaces and felt quite guilty about it, to be honest, because that's how, so, like, I spent so much of my education prior to this focusing on these issues. And it just felt like a very daunting space where nothing was really happening. Except then when you were able to jump over and like all these people were gathering, I found it to be a very compelling idea of taking up physical space as a way to kind of demand action, especially in these university spaces, which actually do have a lot of power in terms of what the administration is doing. And so I found it, and this is like again my privilege to be able to like, what do I want to involve myself in, what do I not? But I found that I really liked the idea of this being where that someplace where I could like physically use my body in a way that I found to be could be a really effective way to enact change, similar to protesting, but in a way that I thought could be more immediate in some way.
And interesting, I mean, Colombia has an interesting history with student protests tracking back to the Vietnam War. And so there are undoubtedly parallels to activism and wanting to raise your voice as a Columbia student in particular, given that history. Do you, when you reflect on it, though, in that experience, it's not just I'm sure it was very peaceful in many ways within that encampment, but the way it's covered in the media, you see counter protests. There are, even the way the Columbia Spectator certainly identified other Jewish voices from outside that encampment who, in one case, described feeling unsafe, but in other cases, a long list of people who described instances that were terrible. And you could, I'm sure, have many people within the encampment who would say, no, we aren't voicing our concerns about Jewishness. We're voicing our concerns about the Israeli government's actions as against Palestinians, and we're standing up for Palestinian human rights. You're a young Jewish woman in those encampments wanting to stand up for human rights. How did you see that kind of anti-Semitism? Did you stand up against it when you saw it?
I mean, this is where it gets super complicated because, to be honest, within the encampments, it was so nice. Like, I was involved in Seder's every single time there was any kind of Jewish holiday or even like
Right,
a
yeah, Passover
holiday.
happened while
Yeah,
the encampment was ongoing, right?
exactly. I went to the Passover Seder, there was Shabbat, there was Havdalah. Like, it was very, very nice. There was a huge contingent of students from Jewish Voice for Peace. Like a lot of Jewish students, there's absolutely no animosity within the encampment. I know there were some anti-Semitic statements that were happening outside the gates. There's a lot of like protests. There was a lot of people from like other groups that came to show solidarity, but like sometimes those messages would be not necessarily the same as like what you would be saying inside. There would be shouts of like "Go back to Europe," or just some comments that a lot of students found very made them feel like they weren't welcomed on campus. And so I understand there's a lot of students that I know personally who felt very unsafe. It gets really complicated though because a lot of what we were saying within the encampment and a lot of the Jewish students who were kind of aligned with this with the encampment is the idea that anti-Semitism is not the same as obviously like condemning like the Israeli government or policies like that. Those are not the same thing. Like you can be anti-Israel without being anti-Semitic. Recently, this statement came out that was signed by a huge amount of students at Columbia saying most of us Jewish students aren't actually even practicing, but what does align us is our faith in Israel, which is funny because there's now a flip of the script where a lot of students are saying anything that is anti-Israel is inherently anti-Semitic, even if none of us are like feel very Jewish. We feel very aligned with Israel. So all of these messages keep kind of getting conflated. And so it's very hard to know at any point, like anything you say against Israel is going to be taken as anti-Semitic. And so that's why a lot of students did feel very unsafe, or felt like they were being personally critiqued. It's just a lot of different narratives going against each other, which make it very difficult to say anything that is universally accepted.
Yeah, and yet it really shouldn't be so hard. And so far as there were a couple of profs that weighed in at Columbia drawing the distinction that there's a difference between the university's willingness to protect its students against anti-Semitism versus students protesting military tactics against civilians and costing great casualties across the civilian population, an innocent civilian population. And Professor Coburn said there's this narrative that it's all anti-Israel and no anti-Semitism, and there's this other narrative that it's all anti-Semitism and none of it is about Israel. And in her view, she says, I believe we just have not modeled listening to each other. And I worry sometimes, at the Justice Committee here in Canada, there's a study about anti-Semitism on campus, and no doubt anti-Semitism has increased since October 7th, and we need to crack down on anti-Semitism targeting Jewish community and our Jewish neighbors and Jewish citizens. At the same time, one has to be free to criticize the state of Israel, and just today, the International Criminal Court is saying that Netanyahu and the defense minister Gallant are effectively alleged war criminals, right? So, I mean, if you can't criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic, then we've ended up in a terrible place. And if you can't, if we can't condemn anti-Semitism because of concerns around, well, then you're supporting Israel in some fashion, then we've ended up in a really terrible place too. I don't know why we can't just pull these ideas apart.
No, I'm in complete agreement. I think that it's become really ingrained, especially in the US, in terms of equating these two ideas. And this is why the encampments, it was a very safe space for Jewish students. Like, speaking as a Jewish student, I never felt at all threatened or unsafe for, like, because of my religion or identity. And I don't know a single other student who was involved who felt differently from that, who felt like they were threatened. However, I think that it was Trump made a bill or like a law that said that speaking out against Israel was a form of anti-Semitism. And one of my professors actually is currently under, I believe, federal investigation for working, Professor Catherine Franke, for speaking out against some of these issues. And because of her involvement in pro-Palestinian activism on campus, she's under like investigation by the school. And so the double standards that I saw at Columbia were absolutely absurd in terms of there was a lot of academic disciplinary action against students who were vocalizing opinions in support of like Palestinian causes, and those who were saying equally, if not more, violent things, and or let's say more political expression on support of Israel. We're never getting at all the same kind of disciplinary measures.
Right.
Um, and it's really scary because students are now just afraid to speak. Like, a lot of students are just, it's made it so it's a terrifying environment. You don't feel comfortable speaking because you don't know how things are going to be used against you.
It's unfortunate. I mean, you are there, and there's a certain solidarity, obviously, in the encampment. Uh, you mentioned not you yourself did not feel unsafe. What do you make though of the campus rabbi sends a notification to, I don't know, the way it was covered, 300 or so Jewish students to say, don't come to campus for your own safety? And what are we to make of that? And that, and then some of the quotes that you read from out of Columbia are, we're so happy that you Zionists are finally leaving campus. Burn Tel Aviv to the ground. Yeah, Hamas. In Ottawa just recently, where there was a protest, they were effectively glorifying. It was Long Live October 7th. I mean, we should have, I think, free speech ought to be protected, and we ought to defend that, and we ought to defend things we dislike. But we also have to we ought to condemn things that are as atrocious as glorifying terrorism. And so, how you're there in the encampment, and how do you square your experience as against the experience of other Jewish students?
Completely. I think that, number one, as much as I am a big supporter of free speech, I think that we should not say things that make people feel unsafe. I mean, the idea of glorifying October 7th, and it's like a lot of there were a bunch of chants and comments made, especially like in the surrounding protests, not necessarily like not in the encampments, but around, that definitely were like glorifying Hamas and saying like people like who are supporting Israel and the Zionists on campus should be the next victims of Hamas attacks. Like, I think that's absolutely horrific. This is, again, when these movements are so large and so scattered, it's hard to control all of the comments that come out. This is also what got frustrating in terms of what the school was trying to do and everything getting equated, was that that's like not, those things were not being said internally. And those were definitely like one-off comments that a lot of times would happen from outside that nobody would really say like, yes, that's good. Nobody's trying to encourage that kind of commentary. And the internal group organizing the encampments at Columbia, called Quad, um, we're trying to kind of work with surrounding groups to make sure that we had support, to make sure that we were like with the community, but still saying, hey, maybe let's not advocate for Hamas to be killing students on campus, or saying things like this. The secondary issue is that there were a lot of chants from within the encampment and otherwise saying, we don't want Zionists here. And a lot of students took that as being like, you don't want us here. Like, you physically are telling me, if you don't want Zionists here at Columbia and I am a Zionist, how am I supposed to feel safe?
Yeah.
And I do also really, really understand that. That's one of the ones that, like, I personally completely understand why students would feel uncomfortable by that. I also understand why students in the encampments would also be yelling that, because it's kind of a what feels where's the priority? Your safety or my safety? You being a Zionist and saying these things makes me feel unsafe. Me saying that I don't want you to be a Zionist here makes you feel unsafe. And it becomes a
I'm
weird
glad you mentioned this.
balancing act.
So, because I think this is the crux of it, right? It's, uh, I think any intelligent person coming to this ought to be able to differentiate between uh, anti-Semitism directed against Jewish people and hate directed at people because they are Jewish, versus this question of the state of Israel, the the beginnings of the state of Israel, and we obviously just had Israeli Independence Day, and then there's this fight over, in some quarters, the recognition of Nakba Day, and so there is this founding challenge to the state of Israel that becomes fraught, decades and decades and decades later, where to some it's about Israeli independence and to others it is about displacement of my people. And there are two truths here. There's someone who out of the Holocaust is looking for self-determination for their Jewish people and a place for protection. And there's another person who is now unable to go to a place that they live their entire life and will never have that right of return in all likelihood because of the displacement of their people. And both of those truths are real, and so and it's very difficult to navigate that. So when you look at Zionism even alone, and the Prime Minister spoke recently in support of the idea of Zionism, I think on a Holocaust Remembrance Day, and he basically said it's about self-determination for the Jewish people. And anyone who is opposing that version of Zionism, I would say that's a problem, and I would defend that idea of self-determination. If you are instead defending an expansion of Israeli settlements, you're defending the displacement and ignoring the cost to Palestinian lives, and you are looking to expand territory even in the course of this very war. That's a very different version of Zionism that poses a real problem to human rights. That is the crux of the problem. It's a tough thing to square.
I think that Israel-Palestine as a conflict has been why it's taken on such a big space in just public consciousness over the world. Um, I it There's two huge different narratives. Like it's one of those things that people can consider this issue in such a different way in terms of if you are threatening Israel, you're saying that it should not be in existence. It came by through illegal means versus the idea of like these Jews were displaced, they faced a Holocaust, they needed a home. Like there's just such a I don't even have the words. The way that people view Israel is so vast and so crucial to your identity that it kind of like goes beyond your political views, I believe. It's one of the most yeah. So I think that as somebody who approaches this often from like an international human rights perspective, um, it's interesting to look at it from the history, from all these things. People don't know the history. People like to pretend that they know the history. People like to think that if they know the international law, if they know human rights law, if they know these things or what is right or what is deserved or what goes back to the Torah or what self-determination is, um, it gets really complicated because everybody believes that they know like what ought to be. And really it's not as clear cut, I think, as anybody thinks. And so moving forward, I just think that like all anybody really wants is to feel safe. And so when people say like I know a lot of Palestinian students and I have a lot of Palestinian friends or people in the region whose families are like put directly at risk. Um, and it becomes very much like your life versus my life. Like, and that's really hard to communicate, uh, especially on a university level, because it just becomes like, I deserve this, I have this, this is my home, this is my people. And it all becomes kind of like a weird moral competition or based in a lot of things that nobody actually has a good basis on legally or ethically or historically.
It's an interesting point because I think you're right to say sort of the focus should be looking forward insofar as I don't have I'm never going to have the ability to delve into the fraught and complex history in any way that does justification to it. But I do know that we are well past the point where we're well past the need for a ceasefire. We
Yeah.
are well past the need for greater protection for civilian life. We are well past the need for a credible path to Palestinian statehood and to safe and secure Israeli borders alongside safe and secure Palestinian borders. We are well past that time. And then the question becomes, how are we going to get there? And when you think of your student voice and raising your voice alongside other students at Columbia, and something that sparked obviously encampments across North America, do you think it's been a constructive, effective role in terms of raising your voices for change?
Completely, completely. And I think for a lot of number one, just in terms of the publicity that this is like garnered, I think that just like how widespread this has become makes it so that this is now public display. And it's different, I think, than protests in other ways because it's very focused. It's like schools need to be able to show where their money is going, or where is funding being used, especially in American schools. That is like do have like these huge amounts of money that do go to Israel and other kind of like military endowments. I think it's really important for this attention to be put there because I think that typically it has not been kind of the center of anything. Um, Also, just the fact that students don't really know where their money is going is also a focus in and of itself. Um, I think that it's also been very successful in the fact that a lot of these students it is one of their first experiences of political radicalization and political education and understanding what they can do. And so I think that in kind of teaching students that they do have power in how they use their bodies and how they use their money and how they kind of work with their schools and their own specific spaces. Um, it is very successful. And I think it can be a really successful way of enacting change. And there has been a lot of schools I know that have actually voted for more transparency. I think a couple schools actually have voted to have decided to divest from Israel in response. And for those schools who haven't, like Columbia, and a lot of other elite universities that have just decided to try to ignore all the student requests, they have faced such incredible backlash that I think that they will be having to deal with this for a long time in the future. Not just on Israel, but on Israel for sure. But in general, they've like started something that I don't think that they knew they were starting, and so I think that they're gonna have to be dealing with this. And that way the encampments and this one actually was a very powerful way to kind of like force these administration's hands.
Do you think so? I have friends who are at some of these protests, not at the encampments per se, but we've seen protests all across the country at different times. And sometimes the protests are confined in a way that you would expect a protest to be, whether it's at Queen's Park or it could be on Parliament Hill or it could be, a march down a particular street. But at other times, we've seen problematic behavior at the Eden Center, for example, interfering with other people just trying to go about their daily lives, and they're busy with their own lives and they're trying to look after their kids, and now they can't take their kid to see Santa Claus because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It makes no sense, and you're left kind of shaking your head at some of the protesters' tactics. And so even apart from questions of anti-Semitism, there's just the constant nuisance, I guess, in some people's lives. And do you think, and the way the media cover the encampments or the way the media covers the protests in general, did you find it challenging to control the narrative as far as it goes, to control a focus on the real issue of protection for civilians and Palestinian human rights?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that this is also one of the interesting things that I always find in terms of protests in general. The idea of protests is to create a mess or to kind of disrupt in a sense. Like if everything could just people
Yeah, to
could move
afflict the comfortable, right? That's the idea.
exactly. If you can just move around them, then it kind of ruins the entire point. Nobody's going to care if that's the case. If you can just ignore it, the point is that you can't be ignored. Um, but it does get really complicated sometimes because you hear on campus or like people who were against the protests were like, these kids are so stupid. What are they doing? They're just like they're messing things up. Actually, with the encampments, I found it to be quite elegant because they weren't really impacting students in a day-to-day life. They were there. It wasn't really like interacting with other people. It was really the school that was being disrupted in any way as they were trying to like arrange for graduation and trying to set things up. And so it was only the school that they were impacting and not the other students. And so in that way, I found it to be very elegant for the most part. Except when the school decided to kind of shut down and force everybody off campus, that's when it got a little complicated. But again, what I found interesting was that most of the flack or blame got put on the administration, not necessarily on the encampments, because it was the administration that was making wrong decisions. I think that it's important for protests and movements like these to be disruptive. Otherwise, there is no purpose. There is no impact if you're not going to do that. I think that the media and how these encampments were portrayed for the large part was it it was they were not put in a good light. I think that a lot of also media coverage of it conflated anti-Semitic comments and outside protests and blamed students for things that they weren't doing and depicted a lot of encampments in these really horrible ways. I always like to joke that it was basically like a summer camp in there. Probably shouldn't say that, but it was like everybody just kind of took care of each other.
There was a
And then,
camaraderie the way you've described it. There was a real camaraderie.
yeah, and it was like it was clean. It was nice. There was
Yeah.
food. Like people, it was everybody took care of each other. Um, But I mean, it was painted in the media to be these like they're attacking students and nobody felt safe and they forced the administration to like shut down everybody and they're going to ruin graduation. And
And there
I
was a
think a
narrative
lot of
around exclusion of Jews at one point, even from some of these encampments, which is why when I saw you in the, I think alternative media as far as it goes, but I saw you interviewed and your aunt share it, I thought it was quite interesting because it was
yeah.
at the time you guys were celebrating Passover and you had a cedar, and I just found it very interesting. It was a very different depiction from what I had seen some people that I trust otherwise on social media and you know, whether it's Michael Geist or others who were, I think he's a grad of Columbia, and he was like, this is outrageous what's happening from his vantage point, what he was seeing.
Nobody was like that thing. A lot of the media was like, we're not actually in the encampment are not actually going to go see it. They were getting a lot of counter narratives from protesters or how, as we would say, instigators.
Right.
And there were a lot of students. So this is where I think that narrative came from. There would be students trying to come in with Israeli flags or trying to come and talk, and they would give us a whole spiel about, oh, we just want to come and talk, and you a lot of times they'd say, hey, we wouldn't really like you here because you clearly don't really want to talk. If you want to talk, we can try to figure something out. But like, this is not a conversation. So we would like you to not be here right now if you're trying to come in with an Israeli flag, because it's not about, again, excluding Jews. It's
Right.
saying this doesn't really seem to be a good faith effort to try to do anything. So we don't really want to engage with you if this is what's going to be going on. Um, and it would almost be like a ploy to then use for media, being like, they forbade us from coming in. They don't want the Jews here. They're not trying. That's not really that. It was just very easy to spin things and try to, again, instigate um, and cause some kind of reaction that could then be used in the media. And so it was very frustrating because then we had to like talk to every student, or like it was a camp rule that you shouldn't engage with people coming in, try to do things like that, because it would always just be so easily
It would get torqued in
spun.
some way or another. Right. What,
Yeah.
I mean, again, from the outside looking in, I am sympathetic to protests as a general principle, and I'm very wary of the idea of sending in authorities to clear certainly student protesters at a time where unless you're disrupting something that, you know, if the school could not continue to function for some reason, or a particularly important thing that other students were wanting to participate in was blocked for some reason. I mean, rights compete, they collide, and you have to balance rights as best you can. But in this case, I couldn't really figure out why there was such a rush to shut the whole thing down. And then when I saw the the police center, the way, at least this is the way the media covered it. So on the one hand, you can express frustration with media coverage, but I will say the way the media covered the crackdown, they showed it to be a crackdown in many ways. And from your vantage point within, what did that look like on April 30th when hundreds of police, including riot gear, descended upon what ostensibly was a peaceful protest?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that happened here. First, let me just to go backwards a little bit. So for the first wave of arrests that happened, I think that they had to, when the police came, the police, I think it's the commissioner of New York, said they didn't like the police chief literally said they didn't seem to be that dangerous. I don't know why we had to come in and arrest them. And that's like the New York police who said that, which never, like, they're very quick to arrest people. And they were like, yeah, these kids seemed pretty chill. So I don't know why we were here. Um, and then there was a few rounds. There was at one point in late April as well, the president tried to call in the National Guard, but that needed the permission from like the mayor, which they didn't give permission to send in the National Guard to Columbia campus to shut down the encampment, because that would be, again, absolutely absurd. Um, and so there's all these little things where you could tell the president was getting increasingly frustrated and trying to figure out how to shut us down. One of the big things was that they were genuinely trying to set up for graduation. And I know that sounds kind of silly in the big picture, but they were every day trying to stack up chairs next to the encampment. All they wanted to do was get us off campus so they could set up for graduation. And that was a huge, like, if not the biggest consideration that was going on behind the scenes. And that was the main time crunch.
Right.
Was how do we get them off campus before people come here for graduation? And so in the days leading up to the eventual like the huge arrests at the end, it was interesting because they had continuously threatened to have the police come. And they said, okay, you have 48 hours. You have 10 hours. Police will come in the morning. There's National Guard coming. I think they were trying to tire people out and make it so you couldn't sleep, and which was a success. No, everybody's just exhausted by the end. And then police kept coming every day for a lot of the protesters outside of the gates, and you would get scared that they were coming inside, but there was always just always police around campus. And I found this to be one of the silliest things in the world, which is that on one of the last days, the school went around giving people pieces of paper, an announcement that said, if you do not turn yourself in by 2 p.m., leave the encampment and sign this paper, you are automatically suspended. And they said, you have to all be out of here by 2 p.m., sign this paper, you'll be on academic probation for the next year. And otherwise, you will be identified. We know who you are. And if you do not sign this paper, then we will identify you ourselves and suspend you. That day was the day before the anniversary of the Vietnam protests. That was the day that in the Vietnam protests, protesters decided to occupy Hamilton Hall and rename it. So I still can't get over the fact that the school kicked out everybody from the encampments on this day in such a way that made it so everybody had to go, and literally kind of forced them into position to storm into Hamilton Hall and occupy that space, which of course would have led to like massive amounts of arrests. It seemed very like they couldn't have planned it in a way that was more calculated.
Yeah, it couldn't possibly have been a worse way to escalate things further.
No, it was very clear, but it was terrifying. And I have friends who were just on the street there at the time who were just like around the police, like again, hundreds of police with like huge vans and trucks were saying, if you don't get off the street right now, we will arrest you. Like not even people in the encampment, just around. It was very, very scary. There was a lot of videos and things that came out afterwards, which made it clear that it was not done very peacefully. The police was not very done. It was not done in a kind or civil way. There was a lot of police brutality that happened, and overall, I think that it just only like polarized the academic community even more in terms of how to respond to things like this. And the protests are still going on, even though the campus is shut down. And it's kind of empowering to see how these other schools are still championing the cause and try and keep it going.
That's what
Even if
I want to close with. So I've Amgad Elsherif is going to join me shortly. I, how do you want to what would you like to leave people with, especially other students who are maybe protesting or other students who have compassion for the plight of Palestinians, or students who are worried about anti-Semitism on campus and care about human rights, but also want to say, we should be protected and safe as Jewish students too. What do you want to communicate to other students, having lived through what you lived through at Columbia? What's the message you want to leave us with?
I would say that it is important to be like as students, it's necessary to kind of be attuned to what your school is doing. I hope that this is an eye-opening experience, not just in terms of Palestine, but just in terms of all political advocacy, in terms of the power that students can have to kind of make change with how their money is spent, how their bodies are used, and that they deserve to know like where their money is going towards and that they can actually create a lot of pressure just with the means that they do have, even though we're all students. And otherwise, is that one of the reasons why these students were able to keep going is because the students didn't stop. After the first wave of arrests, people did not give up. We're school to school to school, and it's students at Columbia, even though it's been like 2 or 3 waves of arrests, are still going on trying to do more. And I think it's the idea that you have to kind of keep your eyes open to what these institutions are doing and that you cannot stop. And also, obviously, like, in terms of the commentary about anti-Semitism, is that it's like the quote you said earlier. You have to learn how to active listen and to make sure we are like actually understanding what each person is trying to communicate. And it's really easy in this kind of issue to like block your ears and just have your own narrative. But the only way to actually move forward and to make sure people are not only aligned, but like actually progressing and making each other feel safe is that we are working together on this. And I think there is a way to do that. But like not everybody's at each other's throats. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate you joining me. I appreciate you using your voice. I am interested when I see student activism and the people who are so committed to making a difference at such a young age on such a big issue. I hope you maintain and other people maintain that sense of purpose and that sense of making a difference. I think we will all be better off for it. And thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much. Okay, have a good time.
Thanks, Safia. Again, that was Safia Southey, a law student at Columbia University, and I think a very thoughtful advocate. I hope she runs for office one day. It is interesting to see the different responses from administrations to the campus protesters. We've recently seen the Ontario Tech University come to an agreement with student protesters, including to establish an advisory committee to explore the development of responsible investment practices with major student involvement, as well as the funding of 3 undergraduate scholarships for Palestinians displaced by war. And this is a good place to shift our attention because it reminds us what the students are protesting in the first place, the conduct of the war. My next guest is Amgad Elsherif. He's a thoracic surgeon in Ontario, but we aren't talking about his normal medical practice here. No, he's done 3 tours of Gaza in which he has worked to deliver emergency health care, and he has absolutely horrifying stories to share. I met Amgad with other advocates in my office last week and felt his shared experience needed a wider audience. Amgad, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me here. My pleasure.
So we just heard from Safia Southey, who's a law student at Columbia, and she articulated her experience around protests and what she's so concerned about and why she's raising her voice and why collectively they need to raise their voices. So much of the media attention has been focused on free speech, has been focused on the actions of various students in around the encampments, whether they're part of the encampments or not, accusations of anti-Semitism, real examples of anti-Semitism, accusations of Islamophobia and real examples of Islamophobia. I think sometimes we lose sight of what the students are actually protesting. And you are a thoracic surgeon. You have done 2 tours of Gaza recently, is that right?
3, yeah.
3 tours. Okay. Yeah. So you have seen firsthand what the students are protesting. You've described it in writing and in other media interviews that I've heard as a war on children. Tell me, of the times that you've been on the ground in Gaza, including most recently, what has that left you with?
Again, thank you very much for having me. It was devastating, actually, and heartbreaking to see what I saw. And when you see stuff happening on the media, as a physician and surgeon, you try to help and make a difference. From a medical standpoint, unfortunately, what I saw is you realize that what the media is bringing us is only 20 or 30% of reality. The numbers that we hear are not the numbers, are only the number of the counted people who died. But there is lots of other people who are still under the rubble, and there is lots of other people who died from non-war related issues, like non-trauma related issues. There is patients with hypertension, diabetes, and chronic disease that don't have access to medication. For example, the whole Gaza Strip, there is a famous medication called insulin for diabetes. This medication is not around. My friend from Northwestern Sam, he was doing amputations every day for patients who have diabetic foot, which is a very treatable thing. And people lose their limbs because they don't have this medicine. I practice adult thoracic surgery here, so most of my patients are adults, but all the patients that I operated on over there were between 4 years old and 11 years old.
Wait, all of the patients you operated on,
with except of one patient who was 39. It was crazy that the amount of the sniper attacks. So the injuries, if the patient or the whatever the victim you would call it is, and most of them are civilians, or all of them are civilians that I've seen. If they are not dead, they are handicapped. The injuries are here as in the heart, in the chest, in the brain, and it's complex injuries. I saw patients who are maybe 9 years old who are standing in lines to get water for their families. They get attacked by snipers and deadly parts of the body. The people who don't have dressing for the wounds, don't have local anesthetic to suture the wounds. We were seeing patients on the floor, no mattresses, no sheets. So it was very, very heartbreaking to see this happening. And the amount of burns and explosion injuries that require multiple teams to operate on, it's not like only one surgeon. I remember that one case, she was, I think, 20 years old, and she had the explosive injury to the leg, and the orthopedic surgeon is looking at her and said, he talks to the general surgeon and says, if I fix the bone, how would you fix the muscle? And the general surgeon talks to the plastic surgeon, well, if I fix the muscle, how would you close the skin? And the decision, unfortunately, at the end is to do something called hip disarticulation for that 20 years old woman, like remove her, not above knee amputation or below knee amputation, just to remove her whole leg. And of course, there is no prosthesis, nothing whatsoever to help her rehabilitation afterwards. So these are some of the injuries that left me with a bad memory. And in medicine, like if you have a bullet injury, there is an entry and an exit for the bullet, so it goes like in one trap. But the shrapnels spread all over the body, so it attacks different parts of and different systems and different organs.
And it's one thing. It's unthinkable, sniper injuries or shrapnel injuries to kids. But it's interesting when you refer to chronic diseases, even, because when we see the reported numbers, and there are incredibly high reported numbers already, and civilian casualties of especially children are incredibly high and unthinkable on that basis alone. But to your point, when the trucks stopped delivering aid and medical supplies, and even today you see world leaders that strongly support Israel, decry the lack of humanitarian aid that is able to be delivered today. And at one point, it wasn't even a trickle. The taps were turned off entirely. But if medical supplies are not being provided, then people are dying from all sorts of preventable illnesses, and those aren't part of the numbers that we see counted.
And yeah, that's true. And with the AIDS, it's we know we went through Rafah, through the border from Egypt, and we see all these trucks that are lined up before the border. But as soon as they enter, unfortunately, there is chaos, and there is people who are trying to get and get whatever aid they can get. And in the north, the last trip was in late March, early April. I came back on April 10th. We saw the truck drivers coming to us, and they said that they are told to keep driving as fast as they can possibly can, and only stop by this certain point. And as soon as they stop, Nate, people try to get in, and then there is quadcopters attacking them, and airstrikes. And I've seen too many patients who come in because they were injured, try to get the help. So theoretically, the help is going in, but is it actually reaching the people or not? Unfortunately, the Shifa was under siege when we were there, and then we received some of the patients who were at Shifa to that Kamal Adwan hospital in the north, and you see the patients coming dehydrated with you try to examine them, the skin peels off when you try to palpate them and examine them. It's something that's not in the textbooks. I've seen for the first time ever in my life, in my career, that I see patients coming with chronic wounds, and there is worms and maggots coming out of their wounds. I have seen a patient who's 15 or 17, and then in the ICU was a fractured mandible, and there's no way to fix it because there is no wires. It needs a special procedure. So the wound is affected, and there is worms coming out of her mouth, out of her endotracheal tube. And you get puzzled. You just don't know what to say and what to do. And
that's the overwhelming fact of just the volume of tragedy and the horrifying nature of the injuries and the response required. What's the state of affairs for you and like-minded doctors working alongside you? I mean, you lack equipment, you lack supplies, and you're doing your best. It's got to be overwhelming, though.
It was overwhelming. You learn to triage. We were lucky enough that we were able to bring some of the instruments and medications and surgical equipments with us. But whatever we took was not enough, and we left, of course, what we can leave for other patients. But it was overwhelming, and I think there is lots of efforts now by the WHO and the UN to try to bring more equipments and surgical aids and sutures and medications. But of course, now with what we hear in the news now about everything is blocked, and even the Rafah crossing is blocked. So I don't know what's going to happen to these patients. I don't know what's going to happen. The malnutrition is a major. The famine is a major issue there. It's the physicians in that hospital in the north. They are underweight. They drink the IV fluids of the patients. So they have no water. They have no food. I've seen a patient who's 25. She came into the ER with dehydration. Her sodium was 178. This is something that you don't see in any textbook because she's dehydrated and she's totally malnourished. I have no idea how the physicians are living, how the nurses are living, how the patients and the population are living.
And when you hear claims from the IDF that they take the utmost precaution to preserve and protect civilian life and to limit civilian casualties, and obviously there's the ongoing challenge that the IDF will articulate that you've got Hamas fighters that are hiding within the civilian population. I've seen some pretty incredible interviews, though, where IDF spokespeople are pressed when they're, how many civilians have been killed, and they're unable to articulate this at all. When you see notices go out that, an attack's coming, civilians have to move from this location to that location, how effective are those messages, and do you think the IDF is taking the utmost precaution?
I'm not sure they are, actually, because I spoke with people I've seen some of these messages myself and my colleagues, and it comes, they drop it by air, and they send it on the phones. They send it on like Amber Alerts.
You get like an
and
emergency SMS or something.
Exactly, yeah. Move from here to there. So I spoke with the people. I said, you know what? They told you, okay, go from New York to New Jersey. So just go from here to there. And they said, well, you know what? I have moved already 5 times. I am from this part of the north. I am from Gaza. I am from this. And they tell me that even if we go, we get attacked. And this is, we've seen it happening. Like they say that this area is secure, and civilians can go into this area because this other area is under military operation, and then people come from that secure area with devastating injuries, with kids that are attacked by sniper attacks, and women and children coming dead. And this thing that I've seen, and I have very bad pictures that cannot be shared, unfortunately. They cut the body in pieces. It's not like they do like a slice. I've seen one patient who was cut in half, and you see the patient when they try to bury them in the hospital. They put them in the coffins, and so you say, okay, we forgot his leg over there. Just bring his hand is over there. His head is here. People coming in pieces by these attacks. And I don't know. I've seen reports about AI being used to protect civilians, and I have seen reports of, but what I saw practically on the ground was totally different. And I'm sure, yeah, I also read the reports of the fighters like hiding in between the civilians and whatnot. But personally, in the hospital I stayed only in the hospital. So in the hospitals, I haven't seen any of these people, neither in the ER, nor in the operating room, nor in the floors. I am sure they are existing somewhere in Gaza and Strip, but they are, I don't know, under their tunnels or whatever they are. I have no idea. But the patients I've seen, and all my colleagues who are with me, they are all civilians and women and children.
The mass graves were shocking for many. I imagine they weren't shocking to you.
They were actually, because some of these graves, the physicians told us who were there under the siege that some of the people were buried alive. This is something that's back in the and old ages, that people can be buried alive, stripped of their clothes and handcuffed and tied, and their eyes are closed, and it's I've seen there is a hospital called the Khair Hospital, which you don't hear about it a lot in the news. It's next to Nasser Hospital. Nasser Hospital is a complex. It's not only one hospital, it's totally one building. And the WHO said many times that this is protected and it cannot be attacked. And then when it was attacked, it was a disaster, and all the people came stripped off. And in the Khair Hospital, which is an OBGYN hospital, like for delivery of babies and taking care of women and childbirth. And there is a woman who was in active labor. She was forced out of the hospital when she was in active labor. There were people and women who were attacked by soldiers, and they were sexually harassed. And it's one of them. It's a famous story there, where she was attacked for 2 days, abused until she lost her ability to speak. And it's the mass graves in that Nasser hospital complex and in Shifa hospital complex. You can smell it as soon as you walk in, and you will see the lift of bits and pieces of the clothes of the people who are. You can tell that they were struggling, like they were. They showed us the area where people were buried alive, and it was something I couldn't imagine that I can see.
You've got a terrorist attack on October 7th that kills over 1,000 Israeli citizens, innocent people, hundreds more taken hostage. And right away, people rightly say Israel's got a right to defend itself. There are still people who will say, well, what do you want Israel to do? They've got to get rid of Hamas, and the costs are the costs, that we've got to do what we got to do, and so be it. What do you've been on the ground, you've seen the horrors of war, this war on children. What do you say to people today who would still insist that Israel has a right to defend itself however it likes?
I encourage them to imagine that this is happening to their own families. It's if we have an attack, God forbid, if we have an attack here in Canada, and we there is rules for the war, there is rules for for how to defend yourself. There is rules for and it's written years and years ago. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Everybody knows it. So imagine that this is happening to your own kid. If someone his son has a fever of 39 or have a broken arm, or and we rush to the ER, and we people cry, and we see them happening here every day in our healthcare system. So when this is happening in this mass casualty, this cannot be at all a way to respond to a terrorist attack. There is no way that this can be an excuse to have these mass casualties. Because and also from a political standpoint, what are you achieving actually? There is hate, and there is I have no idea, these children and these young generations, what are they going to do in the future? Like when they imagine that he had like 15 members of his family, and he's only one, he's 8 years old, who's taking care of a 4 years old. And these people, you don't know what their future are. I met a kid who was 9 years old. You know what his job made? He works in the ICU at a European hospital as an X-ray technician in the ICU. He's 9 years old. I am trying to imagine what will be the future of this. Who taught him this? How is he trained? Of course, he's doing this to live, or to get like half a penny a day to get some rice or some water. So of course, you're building hate and embedding seeds of hate into the hearts of these generations. And we don't want this to happen. The world has to be in peace. There's political leaders can come to an agreement somehow, but from the medical standpoint and from the humanitarian standpoint, this cannot be at all a solution or a reply to whatever attack it is. And all those who think that way, they can reflect on their own families and their own neighbors and friends, and see if anyone gets hurt, how would you react to this?
From a humanitarian standpoint, it is an unthinkable cost, and that cost, as you put it, in the end, isn't likely to lead us anywhere close to peace, but it in fact leads us further away. Amgad, I appreciate the time, and I can't imagine how you sleep at night, honestly.
Thank you very much for having me.
I don't know how you get those images out of your head.
Thanks, Neil. Well, it's again, as a physician surgeon, we're trained to take care of patients, and I can't claim that I'm brave, and I can't claim that I don't remember the images that I saw, and it keeps coming to me every now and then. But whatever we can do to help, and we'll do this everywhere. We'll do it in Ukraine. We'll do it in Sam, my friend. We went to Ukraine like 4 times, and we do it because this is our oath as physicians.
Thanks, Amgad. Take care. Thanks for joining me, as always. I should have mentioned off the top, but Spain, Ireland, and Norway have recently moved to recognize the state of Palestine. This was a much contested element and emotion we debated in Parliament not so long ago. You can read my rundown at uncommons.ca. But there's an increased and increasing understanding from governments in the UK and here in Canada that the recognition of a Palestinian state cannot wait until the full end of a negotiated process, because it leaves Israel as the gatekeeper of Palestinian self-determination. That's doubly true when Netanyahu and government ministers oppose the very idea. Of course, Hamas is a barrier to realizing Palestinian statehood in practice. Of course it is. And yet, if we believe in a two-state solution, we need to be part of an international effort to create the state of Palestine, to reconstruct Gaza with humanitarian assistance, and to ensure the safety of Israeli and Palestinian borders going forward. As always, if you have ideas for guests or topics, reach out at info@beynate.ca. And otherwise, until next time.